Access to justice is not a diagnosis. Reasserting constitutional court access, due process, and the proper scope of disability law in the modern judiciary, Miss Immigrant USA Civic Identity Movement for Dignity, Access, and Equal Participation. Abstract. This article advances a constitutional recentering of access to justice. It argues that meaningful access to courts is a structural requirement of due process under the 14th Amendment, antecedent to and independent of disability rights statutes. While the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted to remedy documented institutional exclusion of individuals with disabilities from public services, including courts, its purpose was to enforce access, not to supplant constitutional guarantees or to operate as a gatekeeping mechanism. Treating disability status as the exclusive gateway to procedural flexibility distorts both due process doctrine and the ADA's remedial design. Drawing on Supreme Court precedent, statutory interpretation, and contemporary access to justice scholarship, this article proposes a dual-track framework: constitutional access as the baseline obligation owed to all litigants, and the ADA as an enforceable backstop against disability-based exclusion. Access is not an accommodation. Access is the condition precedent of legitimate adjudication. Introduction. The structural error of medicalized justice courts derive their legitimacy from adjudication that is fair, accessible, and proportionate to the interests at stake. Yet modern court administration increasingly conditions procedural dignity on medical or disability classification. Litigants are often required explicitly or implicitly to demonstrate illness, impairment, or incapacity to obtain procedural flexibility such as paper adjudication, remote appearance, or modified scheduling. This shift represents a structural error, not a mere administrative inconvenience. It reframes access to justice as a matter of exception rather than right, of diagnosis rather than citizenship, of permission rather than constitutional entitlement. This error falls most heavily on immigrants, low-income litigants, unrepresented parties, trauma survivors, and individuals navigating courts without institutional support. Contemporary scholarship on remote and hybrid courts confirms that while technological flexibility can enhance participation, courts that treat flexibility as exceptional risk reproducing inequality rather than remedying it. Bannon, Remote Court, Northwestern University Law Review, 2021, Georgetown Journal on Poverty Law and Policy, 2023. Constitutional foundations. Access to courts as due process, not discretion. Court access as a constitutional imperative. The Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized that access to courts is not a peripheral procedural concern, but a core component of due process when the state monopolizes adjudication. In Body v. Connecticut, 401 U.S. 371, 1971, the court invalidated filing fees that barred indigent litigants from initiating divorce proceedings, holding that due process prohibits the state from denying access to the only forum capable of granting relief. The significance of Body lies not merely in its holding, but in its reasoning. When the state conditions access to adjudication on barriers unrelated to the merits, it undermines the legitimacy of the judicial process itself. Subsequent cases have reaffirmed that the Constitution does not tolerate procedural structures that functionally foreclose participation, particularly where no alternative forum exists. B, the functional nature of the opportunity to be heard. Due process is not ritualistic. It is functional. The controlling doctrinal framework articulated in Matthews v. Eldridge, 4424 U.S. 319, 1976, requires courts to assess what process is due by balancing the private interest affected, the risk of erroneous deprivation under existing procedures, and the governmental interest, including administrative burden. Under this framework, physical presence is not a constitutional prerequisite. Written submissions, affidavits, and documentary records may fully satisfy due process where credibility determinations are unnecessary or where legal questions predominate. The Constitution requires meaningful participation, not physical endurance, geographic proximity, or procedural theater. 3. Why the Americans with Disabilities Act was necessary. The existence of constitutional protections raises a critical question. Why did Congress enact the Americans with Disabilities Act? The answer is institutional failure. Despite constitutional doctrine, individuals with disabilities were routinely excluded from public services, including courts, through architectural barriers, inflexible procedures, and discretionary indifference. Appeals in constitutional litigation proved inadequate as remedies. They were slow, expensive, and often inaccessible to those already excluded. Title II of the ADA codifies a clear mandate. No qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of disability, be excluded from participation in or denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities of a public entity, including courts, 42 U.S.C. 1132. In Tennessee v. Lane, 541 U.S. 509, 2004, the Supreme Court recognized that access to courts implicates fundamental rights and upheld Congress's authority to enforce Title II against states. The court emphasized that the ADA responded to a documented pattern of unconstitutional exclusion and was designed to prevent future violations, not merely to remedy past ones. The ADA thus operates as an enforcement statute, not a source of rights ex nihilo. The doctrinal drift, when enforcement becomes gatekeeping. A profound doctrinal distortion occurs when courts or administrators treat the ADA as the exclusive source of procedural flexibility. Under this misinterpretation, litigants must first prove disability in order to receive accommodations that may already be constitutionally required. This approach produces several constitutionally troubling consequences. First, it coerces disclosure of private medical information unrelated to the merits of a case. Second, it stigmatizes litigants who seek procedural reasonableness for reasons such as poverty, distance, caregiving obligations, language barriers, or trauma. Third, it narrows access by transforming due process into a conditional privilege. Contemporary studies of virtual and hybrid proceedings demonstrate that court design choices, particularly defaults and assumptions about participation, determine whether technology expands or restricts access. Stanford Criminal Justice Center, Virtual Justice, 2021, New York Legal Assistance Group, Virtual Proceedings and Access Barriers, 2021. Via constitutionally sound framework, baseline rights and targeted enforcement. This article proposes a doctrinally conservative synthesis that honors both constitutional law and disability rights. First, courts must recognize a baseline constitutional obligation to provide meaningful access using procedures proportionate to the case. Under Matthews v. Eldridge, paper adjudication and remote participation are constitutionally sufficient and often superior, where they reduce error, burden, or exclusion. Second, the ADA functions as a targeted enforcement mechanism where disability-based exclusion exists or is likely to occur. Tennessee v. Lane confirms that Congress intended Title II to remove barriers courts historically failed to dismantle voluntarily. Third, and critically, the ADA must be understood as additive, not exclusive. Courts may not condition procedural dignity on disability status where due process independently supports flexibility. Implications for judicial administration and legitimacy. Judicial legitimacy depends on procedures that are accessible without humiliation or unnecessary classification. Courts can and should adopt default practices that normalize paper and remote adjudication where appropriate, while preserving robust ADA processes for disability-specific needs. This approach aligns with long-standing access to justice scholarship emphasizing user-centered court design and the dangers of procedural formalism disconnected from lived reality. Sela, Online Courts and the Future of Justice, 2016. Baldacci, Assisting Pro Se Litigants in New York City Courts, 2006. Conclusion. The Americans with Disabilities Act exists because constitutional principles alone proved insufficient to prevent systemic exclusion. But the solution to past exclusion cannot be a new form of gatekeeping that conditions access on diagnosis. A constitutionally mature judiciary must hold two principles simultaneously. Due process establishes a baseline right to meaningful access for all litigants, and disability law enforces that right where disability-based exclusion persists. Neither may be administered in a way that narrows dignity or converts justice into a privilege. Access is not an accommodation. Access is the precondition of lawful adjudication. This is the first of many updates over the coming months followers will see. Legal filings and progress reports, educational breakdowns of rights and retaliation, behind-the-scenes stories, personal testimonies from people who said, "I choose immigrant." What you can do now, Miss Immigrant USA cannot carry this case alone. We are calling for help, real help. If you are reading this, we need you to stand with us, to join the board and the class action that will represent the public interest, not just the founders of the organization. This is not about us, it is about all of us. We are giving this stage to the people. Declare and volunteer to serve on the board or as class action representative. Bring your skills. Email missimigrantusa@gmail.com or DM us on Instagram. Share this update with someone who believes in democracy and the right to identity. Our mission remains unchanged: to defend immigrant identity, free expression, democracy, and equal protection under the law, and to remind every institution, from the courthouse to the classroom, that the promise of America belongs to all who call it home.
3, 2, 1.
We are immigrants.
Once again. 3, 2, 1.
We are immigrants.
But God brought me to this moment, and I do want to cry right now. This situation actually showed me how God makes magic in ways that you never could expect.
Thanks to the Almighty God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
And we all, one way or another, are immigrants. If not immigrants in this country, we are immigrants that immigrated from God.
The beginning of new light. After months in the shadows, today marks our first gentle step back into the world. We are deeply grateful for all the love and support. At the heart of this journey are the founders, Magdalena and Shaw, Miss and Mr. Immigrant USA, walking together into hope. Time of healing. It demands honesty, courage, and the willingness to love, even when it hurts. Our story is one of truth, unity, and the power to begin again, to share love. If you, too, are searching for light, remember, you are not alone.
You know why?
Look out, everybody. We might have some flying cakes being flown on the red carpet right now.